So, have you ever looked at your savings account, actually done the math, and just felt this sinking realization that traditional saving simply isn't working anymore? Like, the math just isn't mathing the way our parents promised it would, right? Well, you are definitely not alone. Welcome to today's Daily Brief Explainer. Today, we're going to completely unpack the hidden systemic mechanics that are driving this exact reality. We're going to peel back the curtain on how global monetary policy has fundamentally shifted the rules of wealth and really break down why the economy feels so incredibly different today than it did 20 years ago.
Here's our quick roadmap for today's explainer. First, we'll look at the Great Economic Divide. Second, the era of liquidity. Third, the political spending trap. Fourth, America's massive debt burden. Fifth, the central bank dilemma. And finally, we'll wrap up with the future of assets. Let's get right into it.
Section 1. The Great Economic Divide. It's essentially a tale of two completely different economies.
You know, we're constantly told that the biggest divides in our society are political, right? Left versus right. But if you actually look at the data, the most critical division today is structural. It's financial. It's asset owners versus wage earners. Think about it. Asset owners, those holding the S&P 500, real estate, gold, Bitcoin, they actually benefit directly when the money supply expands. Because their wealth is tied up in finite resources or productive companies, the current system naturally insulates them. But on the exact opposite side of this divide, we have wage earners. This is the group relying strictly on their labor for income. And they're the ones bearing the absolute brunt of direct and indirect taxes, they're funding pension systems they might never even fully benefit from, and most importantly, they face the harsh reality of real inflation, which, let's be honest, often runs a lot hotter than official calculations.
And that brings us to a frankly staggering number, 7 to 8%. Now you might be wondering, why 7 to 8% when the government is telling us the consumer price index is only around 3 or 4%? Well, because this 7 to 8% represents the expansion of the M2 money supply. It's the true rate of currency debasement. This is your real hurdle rate for building wealth. It's this hidden, silent cost that just quietly eats away at the purchasing power of everyday savers. Imagine working hard, saving your money, paying all your taxes, and still essentially losing 8% of your purchasing power every single year simply because the currency itself is being degraded at its source. Mathematically speaking, it makes getting ahead purely through your own labor incredibly difficult.
Because of this, economic critics are increasingly referring to our modern financial structure as, quote, a pyramid scheme against the youth. And honestly, think about the mechanics of it. Whether a young person is highly educated or just working an entry-level job, if they don't already own assets, they are starting out at a severe structural disadvantage. They're stepping into a system that mathematically dilutes their wages just to support existing debt and asset prices. The effort they put in literally buys them less and less of the underlying economic pie.
Moving on to Section 2, the era of liquidity. Let's look at how we rewrote the rules to get here. To understand this, we have to recognize that the world fundamentally changed back in 2008. If you remember the sheer panic of the financial crisis, to stop a total collapse, central banks globally just stepped in and injected massive amounts of liquidity, cash, straight into the system. The old economic textbooks, basically obsolete overnight. We shifted from a free market to a deeply intervened market. Then, fast forward to 2020. Faced with global shutdowns, governments unleashed unprecedented fiscal stimulus while central banks ran parallel, massive monetary stimulus. We are talking trillions of dollars just created out of thin air. They flooded the globe with cash on a scale we had literally never seen before in human history. And today, while we're living in the direct aftermath, we are in an era where markets are heavily, almost exclusively, dictated by this ongoing liquidity.
For decades, investors were basically trained to obsess over traditional economic indicators, right? Corporate earnings, GDP growth, CPI inflation. But today, system liquidity is greater than all of them. Those traditional metrics are increasingly just lagging indicators. The primary driver determining where the stock market goes is simply the volume of liquidity central banks and treasuries are pumping into or pulling out of the financial system. When you inject trillions of new dollars, earnings multiples are going to expand regardless of actual corporate performance. A company might not be producing a single ounce of new real value, but its stock goes up simply because there's just way more money chasing the exact same amount of shares.
Which leads us to Section 3, the political spending trap and the fiscal imbalance.
Now, logically, you're probably sitting there thinking, well, can't governments just turn off the spending tabs? Can we just go back to the fiscal balance we had before 2008? It's literally the multi-trillion-dollar question.
And the answer, unfortunately, is that it's highly unlikely. And that's due to a structural spending cycle.
You see, political systems, no matter what country you're in, are built entirely on incentives to secure votes. Actually fixing massive structural economic issues, like the threat of AI to jobs or deeply unbalanced pension systems, that requires short-term pain. And there is virtually no political incentive for a politician to run on a platform of severe austerity and ethical, responsible resource management. Austerity, telling voters they're going to get less while paying more, is effectively political suicide. So politicians avoid the hard issues, which leads to inevitable, continuous, and structurally permanent fiscal deficits. Governments literally have to keep spending to maintain social order and win the next election cycle. It makes deficits a mathematical certainty rather than just a policy choice.
Let's look at the real-world consequences in Section 4, America's massive debt burden, the interest spiral.
We're going to focus on the U.S. here as the prime example, and this is a frankly alarming reality. The United States right now spends more money just servicing the interest on its national debt than it does on its entire defense budget. Just let that sink in for a second. The cost of simply maintaining past debt has completely eclipsed the cost of the most expensive military apparatus on the planet. And to be clear, we aren't even talking about paying down the principal here. This is strictly the interest required just to keep the lights on.
And the scary part is the math only accelerates from here. For example, consider proposed policies, like Donald Trump's target of a $1.5 trillion defense budget. If government spending increases in massive areas like defense, the public deficit naturally grows. To fund that deficit, the government has to issue more debt. And as they issue more debt, the total interest payments climb even higher. It's not a straight linear line, it's an exponential curve. If debt creates interest and interest requires more debt to pay it off, the spiral just feeds itself faster and faster every single year.
This brings us to Section 5, the central bank dilemma, the paralysis of the Fed.
We constantly hear this tough talk in the media about fighting inflation, right? Things like higher for longer or crushing demand. But we really have to challenge the core assumption here. Can the Federal Reserve actually raise interest rates significantly in this current environment?
The reality is they are effectively paralyzed by a mechanical debt trap. It works in 3 steps. Step 1, when the U.S. Treasury has to pay that massive interest bill we were just talking about, they have to drain liquidity from the financial system by issuing new debt. Step 2, because the debt load is so astronomically high right now, draining that much cash brings the whole financial system dangerously close to freezing up or even collapsing. There simply isn't enough organic demand out there to buy all those bonds. So, Step 3. To prevent that collapse, the Federal Reserve is forced to step right back in and inject new liquidity into the system just so the old debt can be rolled over. Raising rates makes Step 1, paying the interest, mathematically impossible without triggering the systemic collapse in Step 2.
So the crucial takeaway here is that aggressive rate hikes are increasingly just verbal intervention. Central banks will use the fear of rate hikes to do the heavy lifting for them. They'll threaten higher rates to psychologically depress inflation expectations. But mathematically, they know they cannot drastically hike rates without bankrupting the sovereign nation they serve. It would break a system already weighed down by historic debt levels. They've effectively lost the power to enact severe tightening because the reality of true rate hikes would literally crash the entire structure.
Finally, Section 6, the future of assets, navigating the liquidity spiral. Let's pull this all together. So, what does this actually mean for you and your portfolio? Well, if the political system guarantees deficits and the central banking system is forced to continuously inject liquidity to service that massive debt, the mathematical result is ongoing monetary degradation. There's no way around it. Therefore, assets that act as a sponge for that excess liquidity are structurally poised to rise over the medium to long term. Hard assets and equities like the S&P 500, gold, and Bitcoin, they aren't necessarily gaining inherent fundamental value. Rather, the fiat currency they are priced in is losing value, so the nominal price adjusts upwards. They are mathematically adjusting to reflect the expanding supply of currency. In a sea of endless printing, these assets are essentially the life rafts.
Knowing all this, knowing that the system is structurally engineered for continuous liquidity injections and asset inflation, the question is, how will you navigate the liquidity era? Are you going to stay positioned as a wage earner fighting that invisible 8% headwind of monetary degradation? Or are you positioning yourself as an asset owner? It's a massive systemic shift, and it absolutely demands a totally new approach to saving and building your wealth. Thank you so much for joining me for this daily brief explainer. I really hope this helped clear up some of the incredible mechanics driving our modern markets. See you next time.